art changes over time. This means not only that conventions change over time, but that often the complexity and skill involved in mediums increases as artists perfect the craft. This works for things we don't generally realize have actually changed quite a bit. European paintings progressed for hundreds of years until the art fully matured during the Renaissance. In the Middle Ages, European artists for hundreds of years were painting flat scenes that were without perspective, until, centuries later, they were suddenly capable of doing this. This happens because art, like technology, is fundamentally iterative across generations. In Ecclesiastes, King Solomon is attributed with the truism, "There's nothing new under the sun." And there isn't. There are 7 notes in the chromatic musical scale. Over the last 1,000 years of Western musical tradition, those notes have been combined in every sequence possible to create every melody possible. Over time, each generation of artists takes what they've seen or heard and builds a bit on top of it, taking what came before and changing it. Folk becomes blues, becomes rock, becomes this. Now, Sick of It All isn't necessarily better than Leadbelly because music has been a fully mature art form for at least 1,000 years. But you can bet that Leadbelly made more artful music than the first primate dude who blew on a reed of grass while sitting in a swamp. We are lucky to live in an age that has seen the creation and maturation of several entirely new art forms in photography, film, and now games. And with games in particular, I have been lucky enough to have been playing from the very dawn of the medium. I've been there with games from Pomg to God of War, and I've been able to watch all the steps in the maturation of an entirely new art form. When films were first invented, they were so fresh and new. Things that once looked like high-quality productions are basically awful in comparison now. Even the films that are taught and renowned today for being works that changed the medium are worse than nearly every movie that releases every year in terms of craft. Birth of a Nation is still taught in film schools around the country for being the first large-scale epic that used the medium in a way it's used today. In the dawn of film, you had actors, directors, and writers who'd come from the stage. Birth of a Nation was one of the first movies to use the medium to do something you couldn't do on the stage, and it was both a tremendous artistic leap forward and a sensation with audiences. Also, it is racist propaganda, but that's beside the point. And yet, for all of its innovation, watching Birth of a Nation in film classes today makes something pretty clear. While it is still a masterpiece of the medium, it's no longer as amazing, because lots of films in the time since are also amazing, and because it's held back by the technology of the time. Only the very, very best films of the silent era are good enough to even hold a modern audience's attention. Chaplin films, Birth of a Nation, Metropolis, maybe Nosferatu for the impressionist visual presentation and acting performances. That's because when something like the Jackson Lord of the Rings films exist, it's hard to be all that impressed by the grand spectacle of Birth of a Nation, outside of acknowledging it for being ahead of its time. It no longer has the power to move modern audiences outside students of film because it's been left behind by the medium in many ways. With that seemingly strange digression on the nature of art out of the way, today we are going to talk about Spec Ops: The Line. And I made this title a bit misleading, because I'm not going to argue that Spec Ops had a hand in maturing the medium. I'm going to argue that Spec Ops isn't a very good game, and now that the medium of video games is fully matured, it looks even worse in comparison. This is going to be long, so long, and I'm going to start with gameplay, but if you are at all interested in literature or film, I ask you to stick around for the section on the narrative. The story is what this game is lauded for, and that's where my harshest criticism will be. So today, we're going to look at Spec Ops: The Line and place it in its time. I will argue that it was a bad game even for its era, but that in comparison to games released today, it's kind of an embarrassment. I'm going to look at its gameplay systems and visual presentation for sure, but I will pay special attention to its story and why the game is a bad adaptation of Apocalypse Now, a worse adaptation of Heart of Darkness, and a meandering, cliche-ridden, tonally confused work about things that don't actually exist. I am aware that this game holds a special place in people's hearts, and I generally don't get any joy from shitting on things that people like, so I'll just say this to anyone who loves this game. Art is subjective. If you love this game and you got meaning out of its narrative, that is totally valid. I loved Rage 2, and I hate Uncharted 4. But with games maturing as an art form, it's important to see if we're actually holding them up to the proper standard when measuring across mediums, or if we're actually grading on a curve in a still evolving art form that has advanced in stunning fashion in just the last 10 years. Spec Ops may have had a surprisingly decent story in 2012 measured against Call of Duty Ghosts, just like Nosferatu was great compared to whatever other static silent films were acclaimed in 1922. But Nosferatu is an inferior work of art to this, technically, technologically, and narratively. Finally, I put a stupid, totally unjustifiable amount of work into this video, and while I generally don't ask people to like or ring the fucking bell or whatever, I'm going to this time. So if you like what I have to say, or at least how I sound saying it, please like, subscribe, and especially share and or tell a friend. With all that out of the way, let's make people mad at me after the logo. Video games are done. Recently, there's been some talk about whether there will ever be a Destiny 3. I don't know the answer to that question, and I'm not going to guess. I will say this though. Despite the fact that I'm in the middle of a 3-month break from Destiny 2, in my opinion, the game doesn't need a sequel technologically. The first Destiny was a great looking game for its time, but the new Destiny will never need to look or play better. All it will ever need is new content. Maybe new technology could allow for larger levels or for more physics interactions, but it's not really needed for what the game is. The tech has finally gotten to the point where Destiny 2 is completely realized technologically. We are rapidly approaching the point where graphical improvements are no longer even really needed at all. Games don't, and do not need to, look like real life, but they're getting damn close to looking like the movies. My next video is going to be about Metro Exodus and its storytelling by analyzing its DLC releases. And Metro Exodus looks as good as any game needs to look. Red Dead Redemption 3 simply doesn't need to look any better than Red Dead 2. Why would a developer even bother? I'm sure people will try, but for instance, what the hell do I need an 8K TV for? Television now looks so good, anything more is pointless overkill. The video game medium has matured to a point where graphical changes are becoming extremely slight, and even lower budget AA games look impossibly good. But this maturation of the medium isn't just present in regards to visual presentation, where games are about 4 years of graphics cards and better ray tracing integration away from being completely visually convincing outside of VR. Games are now fully mechanically and narratively mature as well. This idea for a video, one about the fact that games are now a fully mature and realized medium, actually started kicking around in my head as I played, believe it or not, Zombie Army 4. Zombie Army 4 is a mid to lower budget second tier AA shooter with a third person perspective. It's about zombie Hitler unleashing zombies on the world. It ends with you killing zombie Hitler for the second straight game. Its third person shooting can best be described as working as intended, and its levels are highly functional for the purpose of killing zombie Hitler. For the next 100 years, Zombie Army 4 will stand astride its levels and shooting and be totally playable and enjoyable because games are just generally all pretty good these days. Zombie Army 4 does third-person zombie Hitler shooting as well as any game will ever need to shoot zombie Hitlers in third person. This third-person zombie shooting has been figured out. We now live in a time where Anthem is considered a disaster, despite it playing better than nearly every third-person game made from the invention of the genre through 2012. And that's because our standards have gotten much higher as the medium has matured. I've touched on this before, but games almost all feel pretty damn good to play these days. Titles that are considered bad games now usually play better than what used to be considered a good game. Zombie Army 4 plays as good as a third-person shooter will ever need to feel, and now it's insanely rare for a game to be released that plays as bad as half of the games that were released in 2008. As recently as 10 years ago, it wasn't all that rare for AAA games to be released with cameras that didn't work or movement that felt awful. Games consistently, utterly failed in the early days of the medium, and it just wasn't rare at all for even big-budget games to end up being just flat-out terrible. That just doesn't happen anymore. There are dozens of indie studios making games that feel better to play than KOTOR every year. When you play Mass Effect Andromeda and then go straight to Mass Effect 1, you see what I mean. Mass Effect is a far more memorable game, obviously, because its storytelling is just so fantastic, but Mass Effect Andromeda is a fully realized modern game mechanically. It just plays better, period. In fact, if BioWare could port the Mass Effect games into Andromeda, they would be perfect forever. Games are fully mature mechanically, and genre conventions are set. You will never play a shooter that uses a face button to shoot your game again. You'll never play an FPS that doesn't use the same 2 triggers to aim and shoot on a gamepad. There is no more experimenting needed. Almost every genre has figured it out, and games with unconventional control schemes are annoying outliers these days. Games have left the silent film era. Going forward, they will be judged only on their content because their craft is fully realized. Mechanically bland. I need to preface this section by simply disregarding an argument that is occasionally made regarding this game. I'll go into detail as we move forward defending my opinion, but for now you'll have to take the following statement as my position. Spec Ops is simply not a very good shooter. I'm going to point out that even for its time, it wasn't very good, but in our time, it is quite poor. Even at release, some brave people were filling Reddit with unpopular opinions like this here. Now, very few of these critiques made the argument that its story is actually a mediocre plot executed badly, which I will argue, but all of them focused on how awful the actual gameplay was. And one of the interesting responses was people saying things like this, that actually the gameplay is awful on purpose. You see, Spec Ops wants to make the shocking and enlightening argument that violence are bad and war is hell, something that nobody had ever heard before this game had the courage to tell the world in 2000. Anyway, I'll get into this argument again later because it ties into the narrative, but for now all I can say is this: I don't buy it. The game is meant to be a fun shooter, primarily because the entire shocking narrative reveal is supposed to make you question having fun shooting people. This only works if, it's like actually fun to shoot people. Secondly, games aren't films. They are an interactive medium. You can certainly make it hard, or uncomfortable, or disturbing to shoot people if it's actually on purpose and needed for your narrative, which again I don't believe was the case here. But disturbing and annoying are different emotions. Spec Ops' gunplay didn't make me uncomfortable. It made me frustrated and annoyed. So there, I reject this argument, and I think it's bullshit excuse making, but even if this is actually the case, and the bad shooting was meant to elicit an emotional response in the player, they did it badly and elicited the wrong emotions through the use of their mechanics. Before we even get to what I consider the game's mechanical failures, we would be remiss to not discuss how little Spec Ops actually brings to the genre. Even the best cover shooters have trouble engaging me, and by the time Spec Ops released, the genre was becoming a plague. Every game that was more focused on telling a story than being an interactive experience defaulted to being a cover shooter by the end of the 7th generation. Most didn't bother trying to improve the genre at all, and Spec Ops does the same by playing it ridiculously safe when it comes to its gameplay. It is basically Gears of Darkness. So let's just talk about Spec Ops as a third-person shooter mechanically. It's simply not very good. The best one can honestly say about it is that it is a competent, average third-person shooter, but I'd argue it's not even that. While I'm willing to give the game some leeway on game feel due to its age, I can't discount the fact that it's a below-average cover shooter without even trying to do anything differently from any other below-average cover shooter. Now, on a positive note, the game is graphically beautiful, holds up remarkably well visually, even today, and for its time, it was positively gorgeous. But Spec Ops wasn't released in 2005. This is a game from 2012. By the time Spec Ops had released, the genre had seen Gears of War 1 and 2 and 3. Vanquish had been released. Mass Effect 3 was released only a few months after Spec Ops. Now, all of those games have aged quite a bit, and even the best cover shooters of that era don't play as well as modern versions do, but they at least hold up enough to be playable without risking me throwing a controller through my monitor. Mass Effect Story, even with the ending, has aged amazingly well, even though the first game's shooting was rough. But Mass Effect 2 was pretty good, and Mass Effect 3 is quite good for its time. And the combat in those games can be forgiven not because the story was of a high quality, but because it wasn't really even a cover shooter. It was a dialogue and quest-based RPG that happened to use cover shooting rather than a KOTOR-style turn-based system for its combat. The Gears games feel dated, but they are still enjoyable to play today because the combat there is the focus and it feels like it. Still, to be fair, I will grade Spec Ops on a curve for its game feel by mainly judging it in relation to the shooters of its day. And even in that light, Spec Ops fails at many of the most important aspects of its systems. So what makes a good cover shooter? I could be cheeky and say nothing, but I won't do that. I'm not a big fan of the genre, but I can appreciate the games that do it well. And of course there are differences between titles that make some better than others. The best of the cover shooters generally need to pay an awful lot of attention to their cover and movement systems, their pacing, arena design, enemy design, and to the actual shooting feel. None of the mid to late 2000s shooters had game feel as good as Gears 5 or The Division 2, or say, even something as flawed as Quantum Break. But the best ones worked within the limits of the available technology to craft combat that still felt engaging. Let's take Gears of War, a game released 6 years before Spec Ops, and the game that really cemented the cover shooter as the bane of the 7th console generation. Even though I found the Gears games a little bland at the time, I didn't find them boring or frustrating, and I never thought for a second that they were badly designed. In fact, in anticipation of doing this video, I went back and played it again, and I found that I enjoyed it far more than I remembered. I don't actually have an overarching hatred of the cover shooter, it just irks me that so many of them were designed so unimaginatively and seemingly haphazardly. Genres can only be iterated on so much. An FPS needs to be an FPS first and foremost. But so many of the narrative-focused games of the 7th generation feel like a cover shooting gameplay loop was just thrown in to have a popular genre on the box, and not because that combat system was something the developers wanted to explore mechanically. And of course, I vastly prefer first-person shooters. On first glance, Gears and Spec Ops are remarkably similar in terms of gameplay design, so there's something else beyond simple age or being a cover shooter that makes Spec Ops such a chore to play for me. And I need to make clear that I came into this game thinking I was about to play one of the rare classics that I hadn't yet played. I didn't come in looking to have a bad time. At a basic level, third-person cover shooters share most of their core mechanics in the way that first-person shooters or hack-and-slash action games do. In fact, the cover shooter might have less diversity in systems than any other genre. A ton of systems and mechanics that Gears made popular doggedly remain genre conventions to this day, and Spec Ops is clearly designed with Gears as a starting point. Both games have the close third-person camera that Gears established as the primary style for these games. Both have that same high-zoom, camera-shaking sprint that many of these games use. Both use the A button or spacebar for both sprint and cover. X reloads, picks up guns, and revives teammates, and both games are basically laid out as a series of short walks during which dialogue and story happens before arriving at a combat arena with the occasional cutscene sprinkled in for larger narrative elements that can't be accommodated within gameplay scenarios. While those basic systems are nearly identical in both games, there are miles of distance between how the titles actually play. To begin with, Spec Ops just feels bad. It uses the same sprint system as Gears or Mass Effect, which I've always found annoying, but Spec Ops has such poor control that the system is kinda game-breaking here. I suspect that Gears invented this zoom-in camera shake sprint thing to further a cinematic experience, and it definitely accomplishes that. But what it does to your character's movement is, to my eye, disorienting, and sometimes literally makes me queasy. Gears makes you feel stiff and sluggish when you push Marcus to a sprint, perhaps to really drive home that you should not be running around like crazy. Spec Ops, though, makes you feel like you're drunk. Walker controls abysmally at all times, and at a sprint, he is almost impossible to turn at all. Third-person shooters are designed to be unforgiving mechanically, so control of your character is absolutely essential. Having an important mechanic feel so clunky hurts the game. Early on, when it's quite easy, this doesn't feel like much of an issue, but as the difficulty ramps up, it gets quite frustrating when deaths result from an inability to move Walker where you're trying to get him to go. Now, if you're going to make a cover shooter, you've got to get the cover part of your shooter right. Even though Marcus Phoenix controls stiffly, the cover mechanic itself holds up remarkably well. He gets in cover when you want, and he gets out of cover easily. In the rare instances when something goes awry, he has a dodge roll to get out of cover and escape danger. Perhaps just as importantly, everything in a Gears arena that looks like could be cover works as cover. The arenas in Spec Ops have the incredibly annoying habit of being littered with geometry that looks like it should serve as cover, but in fact just doesn't. So you'll run over to a half wall or a car and find that actually Walker refuses to recognize this as cover, so he'll just stand there and get you killed. And even getting into spots that are designed to be cover can be frustratingly wonky. Walker consistently fails to get into cover when you want him to, and he remains glued to cover when you want him to move. The system is bad. It's actually a rare treat when everything works as it should, and in those moments, suddenly Spec Ops is pleasant enough to play. Unfortunately, it is very rare for an entire arena section to go by without something breaking. It is simply a bad, dated system that doesn't work like it should, and in light of newer systems, it just feels awful. Regardless of what you're trying to do narratively, the core systems of your game need to function properly. And in video games, especially ones that kill you as often as Spec Ops wants to on harder difficulties, deaths need to feel like the player's fault. Spec Ops just simply fails at this. And again, this game wasn't released in 1999, or even 2006. It came out in 2012, years after most of these issues had been figured out by the leaders in the genre. Most of the best cover shooters from this era feel good to play because it's clear the system wasn't chosen as an afterthought. Spec Ops, like many of the lesser games of the era, feels like the idea for the game's story and themes was the main focus, and the interactive elements and gameplay systems were chosen based on what was thought to be popular at the moment. Gears of War isn't a cover shooter by default. It's a game designed specifically around exploring its combat and its mechanics. Gears wants to be the best cover shooter it can be. Spec Ops, like many of its contemporaries, wanted to tell a story, and fit that within an established genre. That might have been fine if the mechanics were at least of a high degree of polish, but they are not. Spec Ops consistently fails at things that need to work. The game was inexplicably designed with outrageously low ammo counts for each weapon, yet it routinely throws dozens and dozens of enemies at you in each room. Beyond just getting really tedious, this means the player constantly needs to pick up weapons from dead enemies and use them. Several of these weapons are extremely situational, which means it's not uncommon to only have weapons in reach that are completely useless for the situation you're in. You can often find yourself pinned down by a sniper armed with a shotgun and an SMG. And because the game kills you after being shot only once or twice, this means restarting from a previous checkpoint, which are also, by the way, terribly implemented. And then there's the fact that Walker tends to just stand up out of cover when you try to pick up a new gun, leading to your death, or that he'll simply be unable to pick up the gun despite pressing the button, or that he'll stick to cover and not be able to grab the weapon because of how it's placed. Fully 90% of the times you die will be the result of issues with input or cover that suddenly fails to stop bullets because Walker stood up for no reason, or you couldn't crouch down. Spec Ops is an incredibly short game as it is, which allowed me to play it twice in 2 days. A decent percentage of its playtime is taken up with you dying because the game doesn't work properly. It's just very clear that refining gameplay was not the top priority of this game's development. Then there's the actual shooting mechanics. Many of the early to mid 7th generation console shooters featured shooting that did not require pinpoint accuracy, and this goes like triple for cover shooters. In general, most of these games featured insane amounts of bullet spread, and they all default to sensitivity settings that feel really sluggish to the modern player. And this is as much to do with us as players as it is to do with the games themselves. It may seem strange, but we, as players, are simply better than we used to be. The Division 2 is an incredible snappy shooter, even with a controller, with sensitivity and acceleration that is smooth and quick. None of the early cover shooters played like this. If you test out the default aim down sight speed on older cover shooters, it's shocking how slow they are. Gears still plays really well, but it takes getting used to. Because fast reticle movement isn't really possible, enemies are generally slow and don't move around a ton, and they're generally large enough to allow the player to slowly swing his cursor over the target. But even allowing for the slower pace and sensitivity of the era, Spec Ops just really controls badly with a gamepad. I will never be able to know what it felt like for players at the time, but this style of control has not aged well, and in Spec Ops the controls just aren't really refined compared even to its contemporaries. Compared to modern cover shooters, it's almost unplayable at times. There's a pronounced dead zone in Spec Ops controls when aiming down sight, and the acceleration is so strangely uneven that actually staying on target is a chore. Now, this isn't really an issue with a mouse and keyboard, and the game does play passably well with that setup. But the best cover shooters of the era play well on both platforms, and games need to be judged on both. In fact, despite generally using a mouse and keyboard for most shooters, I find Gears to control a bit better with a controller, because movement and sprinting feels more intuitive. With Spec Ops, small adjustments are nearly impossible with a gamepad, as the dead zone makes you need to apply too much pressure to even get the crosshairs moving. It's just super common to spend time moving your cursor up and down again and up again until you finally find the sweet spot and are able to aim. This certainly adds to the difficulty on offer, but the difficulty doesn't come from fighting the game's enemies, but rather from fighting the controls. Most deaths are the result of a combination of terrible movement, a broken cover system, and the worst shooting controls I've had in my hands in many years. I honestly can't think of a worse example. Maybe Mass Effect 1? This stuff matters. It has always mattered. Game feel is one of the most important parts of the art form, and Spec Ops is just bad in that department. Whatever you think of its story, the fact remains that Spec Ops fails at one of the most important parts of the art form. Its controls don't work right, and it doesn't feel good to play. Finally, let's look at what's perhaps the most important aspect of any shooter, but especially a cover shooter: arena design. All shooters can only really differentiate their gameplay through a few different things. When it's all said and done, the entire game will always boil down to targeting enemies and shooting them. The games that succeed at keeping this engaging all the way through a campaign do so by giving you enemies and arenas that feel different to fight. Spec Ops is constrained by its setting, and that it can't have giant locust monsters to cut up with a chainsaw gun, but the Division games have the same constraint and manage to keep the gameplay intriguing through well-designed levels and arenas. Gears is a more fair comparison because it developed a full 6 years before rather than 6 years after Spec Ops. Gears' levels almost all feature emergent gameplay entirely through the design of the enemies and especially of the arenas themselves, not the visual design, which is one of the only things that Spec Ops actually excels at, and again, to be fair, it really excels at that, but rather the actual layout of the arenas themselves. Gears arenas have multiple routes for flanking. Cover is laid out in a way to encourage experimentation and variety, and the game rarely feels like it's repeating itself. Almost all of the arenas in the first Gears game feel like unique, different encounters that are testing different things in the player. Gears levels make you feel smart for having figured out the most efficient way to progress through them. Spec Ops is quite remarkable for the utter lack of creativity present in its arenas. a shocking number are literally square boxes with bad guys on one side and you on the other, and a layout that makes flanking all but impossible. And remember, the entire genre is based on the slower, more methodical gameplay that arises from needing to be careful and get good angles on enemies. More than any other cover shooter I have ever played, the correct response in Spec Ops is to stay exactly where you are and slowly pop up and shoot each dude on the other end of the arena. Switching cover is death, because there's a 75% chance Walker will fail to get behind the rock you're shooting for, or your brain-dead NPC companions will prevent you from getting behind it. That's when they aren't just standing up and getting themselves killed in a place you can't possibly revive them. There are only a tiny handful of decent arenas in the entire game, and they're memorable not because they're particularly good, but rather because the rest are generally quite bland. This lack of creative agency for the player manifests all over the place. It replicates all the worst aspects of a Rockstar or Call of Duty mission. There's precisely one way to tackle every situation, and if you deviate even slightly, the game says no. In the pointlessly tacked on stealth sections where you need to rescue civilians, you must follow directly behind Adams. Even if you kill the sniper on the roof, if you get more than 3 feet from Adam's side, enemies are alerted even though there's no line of sight between you and them. Why? And what's even worse about this, if you fail, you need to start at the last checkpoint, which is before the enemy dialogue. Why? This stuff is everywhere. Arenas have a clear right and wrong way to play them. For a game that clocks in at less time than it takes to read the actual novella or watch the director's cut of the movie, this doesn't even give players a reason to go through it again. It plays precisely, exactly the same every time except for 2 decisions that ultimately don't matter at all. There are multiple turret sequences that when I played on PC, I literally completed like this. This is not only a mediocre shooter, it's a derivative and boring one that has zero thought put towards player agency. Finally, there's the way that Spec Ops handles its health. The vast majority of cover shooters use regenerating health, and Spec Ops sticks to the formula. But even this standard system isn't carefully implemented here. The flow of combat in a cover shooter is for the player to pop up, quickly shoot targets before going back into cover when they're damaged by hit-scan weapons. This means how you communicate damage to the player and how long the health takes to start recovering is crucially important. If health comes back too fast, the game loses much of its attempt at tactical gameplay because Zerg rushing is suddenly viable. If it's too slow, the player spends the vast majority of their time looking at a waist-high concrete wall, waiting for the game to let them play again. Spec Ops has its health regeneration take too long, even if we're only talking here about seconds. Because the game makes the player character so comically squishy on hard difficulty, you can only pop out to aim for like 2 or 3 seconds, before the edges of your screen get splattered with blood, and you're forced to squat down behind a rock again. And once you squat back down, you'll be down there for too long. I cannot tell you how many times I sighed loudly and literally put the controller down next to me as I waited for the game to let me play again. This is a matter again of very small tweaks, but here, like so many other places, Spec Ops feels all wrong mechanically. It's a game where every one of its combat systems is done somewhere between mediocre for its time and downright bad. And again, these are not new or innovative systems. The game makes a confusing effort to change things up occasionally with the most half-assed stealth system I have ever seen implemented in a game, bar none. But even there, the system is either superfluous, pointless, or broken. Spec Ops has you shooting the same nondescript dudes with the same weapons and the same garbage cover system in square, boring arena after arena after arena. It is amazingly dull most of the time, broken up only by the times it's downright annoying. The defenses you see of this gameplay is that it avoids ludo-narrative dissonance, because the player becomes just as exhausted as Walker does by the end, but that's not actually true either. The feeling you get isn't exhaustion, it's frustration. Frustration at how mediocre it is. Frustration at what feels like a game that was designed to be a clever story, but with very little attention paid to making it a decent game. Not all games need to be fully based around being interesting mechanically, and there's a place for using games to more fully explore narrative elements. Mass Effect is a wonderful example, as are many of the early CRPGs. Tacoma is one of my very favorite games ever. Oxenfree is one of the most underrated games of recent memory, and I consider Edith Finch to be perhaps the best example of the medium doing narrative in a way that no other medium can. So if Spec Ops wanted to be a more narrative experience, that is perfectly acceptable. However, Spec Ops is a shooter. The developers made a cover shooter, and it needs to be judged not only on its narrative, but also on its cover shooting. It's bad enough that it was already an exceedingly mediocre game for its time, but now that the medium has matured so completely, it stands out as a game that can barely be tolerated long enough to appreciate its supposedly amazing story. And spoiler, that's not very good either. An excellent example of a game that seems as if it was trying to accomplish similar things to Spec Ops is The Last of Us, another third-person cover shooter with light stealth mechanics. Although The Last of Us stealth actually works and is important to the game mechanically and narratively. I've told people this before, but when I finished The Last of Us, I turned to my wife and said, "Holy crap, that was amazing, and I never want to play this again." The Last of Us actually accomplishes what Spec Ops is lauded for. The violence and tone of that game absolutely does beat you down. By the end, the player feels exhausted and depressed and uncomfortable. Despite its mountain of violence, it doesn't suffer from ludo-narrative dissonance because, like Spec Ops, it's a game that wants to use its violence to make you feel deeply uncomfortable. But it does that through tone and a story that's told as well as any story ever in a game, and in the way the violence itself is implemented. It doesn't pawn off broken mechanics as some grand statement on violence. It manages to be both a competent cover shooter and a powerful and compelling work of fiction that communicates its narrative through theme, story, and gameplay, without resorting to, sucking, supposedly on purpose. Even if I allowed that Spec Ops The Line was a competent shooter for its time, and to be clear, I absolutely do not concede that, but even if I did, the maturation of the art form means that from a gameplay perspective, Spec Ops may as well be an average silent movie compared to games today. If the gameplay was ever acceptable, the medium has passed it so completely, it's not even worth playing anymore. And it's only been 8 years. Spec Ops Heart of Darkness. Okay, this is tricky, because there is no doubt that compared to the games people were comparing it to, Spec Ops does indeed have a far more ambitious story. But I'm not interested in comparing Spec Ops to Call of Duty Ghosts. Yes, Spec Ops has a better story than Ghosts or Advanced Warfare. And yes, it's a more ambitious effort than Gears of War, but I don't judge art on a curve. Just because I draw better now than I did at 7 doesn't mean my drawings aren't still garbage. I am both simultaneously better than I was at 7 and still total garbage. Gears of War isn't terribly ambitious in its storytelling. Instead, it sets out to tell a fairly conventional story and tell it well. Call of Duty Ghosts sets out to tell a conventional story and fails hilariously. Spec Ops The Line sets out to tackle heavy themes and adapt one of the greatest novels in the Western canon of classics and fails completely. And here's where we'll once again bump up against the maturing of the medium issue. In the 7th generation, games with great stories were somewhat rarer than they are today. Even the ones that were considered to be good fall catastrophically short of any of the other established narrative mediums. There are only a very small number of games that succeeded in creating all-time great narratives. Games like the Mass Effect Trilogy, Red Dead Redemption were rare examples of games telling stories that couldn't really be done in any other medium. They used the medium of games to tell unique stories as good as any other that were supported by their mechanics and gameplay systems, not in spite of them. Shadow of the Colossus used the medium in a sort of impressionist form to create a world that powerfully affects the player through visual design and gameplay. But most of the better stories from the previous generation, and before, were simply excellent genre pieces. Dead Space is an amazing game that narratively is just a good horror story and a sci-fi story. Uncharted is just a very good action-adventure story, etc. Today, games have fully matured as a medium, and shockingly good stories that couldn't be told in any other medium are no longer rare at all. Red Dead 2 is a wonderful narrative experience, even though I think it's a bad video game. The Last of Us, The Witcher 3, What's Become of Edith Finch, Firewatch, Oxenfree, Tacoma. Games no longer need to be judged on a curve as an art form. Gears 5 is as good an action journey story as you will ever experience that uses its gameplay to augment everything it does. Mass Effect, Hollow Knight, Control, Metro Exodus, the BioShock games, Portal. All of these games aren't trying to tell stories like films. They're using the medium of games to tell amazing stories that cannot be told any other way. Games don't do adaptation very well, because games work best as games and not movies. Spec Ops not only tries to do an adaptation, something that has very rarely worked in games. It tries to adapt one of the most complex and challenging novels in the Western tradition. If you want it to be more generous, you could say it's trying to be a game adaptation of an amazing film adaptation of an amazing novel. But looked at either way, it doesn't work. It might have been an effort at being good for its time, it might have succeeded at being better than Call of Duty Ghosts, but I'm not interested in thinking of games as toys for kids. I'm interested in games as their own unique art form, as interesting and compelling as a novel in their own way. If you set out to do an adaptation of something as important as Heart of Darkness, you should be judged alongside Heart of Darkness, and not alongside Call of Duty Ghosts. With any adaptation in any medium, it is only natural and fair to compare your adaptation to its source. I don't judge Game of Thrones against Law & Order SVU. I compare it to A Song of Ice and Fire. And it's awful. A failed adaptation. Adaptation is a dangerous business, man. There is no hard and fast rule for what makes an effective adaptation, but there are some things that need to happen for a work to be considered successful. If you want to use another work as scaffolding, if you want to adapt a work, you have to expect an audience to have certain expectations. An effective adaptation needs to ultimately convey the same themes and emotions as the source material, otherwise, what's the point of adapting the work? If you're not going for the same emotional response and themes and tone, you may as well just write a thoroughly original work, which I wish these people had done. On top of that, your adaptation needs to have a reason to exist. You don't adapt a novel to a novel unless the source material is so ancient it can no longer be enjoyed by a modern audience. The purpose of adaptation is to take a work and bring it to another medium, thereby doing justice to the source material while using that new medium or a modern setting to bring elements that couldn't be accomplished otherwise. Movie adaptations of novels work by taking complex pieces of literature and using the visual language of film to distill them down to smaller works that communicate visually what's generally done in the reader's mind. Novels generally stimulate the reader in an internal, cerebral way, while films are better at generating immediate, visceral, emotional reactions in an audience. Games can separate themselves from film only by accounting for the agency of the audience. The only thing that games can do that films cannot is allow for the active participation of the player. So any adaptation needs to use the unique strengths of the medium to do something the novel or film cannot. Spec Ops certainly tries to make an honest attempt to adapt the story of Heart of Darkness. That is to say, Spec Ops isn't schlock. I can't stress this enough. Spec Ops is not Call of Duty Ghosts. But it also doesn't succeed as an adaptation because its gameplay fails to follow through on its themes, and its story doesn't do justice to the immense complexity of the source material. To demonstrate this, we need to spend just a minute coming to agreement about what Heart of Darkness and Apocalypse Now are actually trying to say to us. Spec Ops: The Line tends to be rather confused about what these titanic works are actually about. And to be fair, that's somewhat understandable because Heart of Darkness is over 120 years old, and the book is still being argued about to this day. There are entire literary critiques debating whether or not Heart of Darkness is fundamentally tainted by its racist stereotypes, or whether the book is best understood as a personal or political critique. I'm not here to wade too deeply into that debate. I'm not a literary scholar, though I do play one on YouTube. I'm a reader, though, and Heart of Darkness remains one of my favorite books, so I can only approach the book, film, and this game as what I am, a careful, thoughtful member of the audience. And only from that perspective can I examine these works for what they've said to me. Both Heart of Darkness and Apocalypse Now are troubling works that leave the audience conflicted and uneasy. The film and book have different settings and different historical and political contexts surrounding them, while still ultimately using these different situations to tell the same story, with the main difference between them being that there's no war going on Heart of Darkness while there is an Apocalypse Now. Spec Ops seems to want to distill these works down to the simple observation that war is hell and violence is bad. And though the Coppola film certainly comments on the brutality of war, it is not about that. Politically, both works are actually primarily focused on colonialism and what it does to the civilized man. They're both about power and what absolute power does, and ultimately about what you would do with it. They try to examine what a person elevated to a near godlike figure does and tells themselves about what they do. They're about the very ideas of right and wrong and civilization itself. They are ultimately philosophical works. All of that stuff could be said to be in Spec Ops in one fashion or another, but it doesn't handle any of those themes with even close to the power its source material manages because it's missing one of the most important things about both of those works. What it misses is that the setting of these works are crucially important in a way that Spec Ops fails at. So let's talk about setting and themes. Congo to Vietnam to Dubai? One of the most important themes of Heart of Darkness is laid out bare right at the start. At the very beginning of Marlowe's tale, he's talking about how Britain was once a savage land when the Romans first arrived. Thinking out loud about the Roman conquest of Britannia, he tells his companions this.
They grabbed what they could get, and for the sake of what was to be got, it was just robbery with violence. Aggravated murder on a great scale, and men going at it blind, as is very proper for those who tackle a darkness. The conquest of the earth, which mostly means the taking it away from those who have a different complexion or slightly flatter noses than ourselves, is not a pretty thing when you look into it too much. What redeems it is the idea only. An idea at the back of it. Not a sentimental pretense, but an idea, and an unselfish belief in the idea, something you could set up and bow down before and offer a sacrifice to.
That's what Heart of Darkness is about. Heart of Darkness was written for a white European audience in the age of African colonialism, and it can only exist and work in that context. It was a time where vast wealth was being sucked out of Africa, enriching Europe as a whole under the guise of civilizing the native Africans. Nominally, Europeans were talking about trade, but in reality that meant theft. The supposed civilizing mission was just a myth that Europeans told themselves to justify what any sane person would immediately recognize as an atrocity. You can't remove colonialism from the work as a theme. This is layered deeply in the text, so completely you find more examples on each reading. Only on this most recent read did I realize something new. Several times Marlowe talks about drinking tea. This made me think about how tea has become a central part of British and European culture, but tea doesn't grow in England, dude. Tea was a spoil of war. Kurtz's dying line, the horror, is still debated, but a perfectly good interpretation is a deathbed realization of the full horror that has occurred once the white civilizing European is left alone to dominate the colonial possessions. This story works because everyone who read it knew about African colonialism while trying as hard as they could to remain ignorant of what that actually meant on the ground. That's where the civilizing myth becomes necessary. Without that myth, how could any person live with themselves and have the gall to call themselves civilized? Conrad descends into Africa looking for a businessman who long ago realized that his profit-taking was actually godlike domination and then fully embraced it. Kurtz has let all the bullshit fall away. He's not a part of the myth anymore, and instead of keeping the thin veneer up, he's just gone hog wild. He's been lauded as the best his company has because he's producing the most ivory, literal piles of it, not because he's civilizing the natives. When it's discovered that he got this ivory by becoming a godlike chief to the local natives and leading them on raids of murder and mayhem, his employers want him removed. Not because they care about the natives, they clearly do not, but rather because it's ruining the myth and making a mockery of it. The carnage surrounding Kurtz is no different from everything else around him. The other businessmen are beating and starving their African thralls to death. They literally lament the annoying noise the dying natives make because it interferes with keeping the books carefully. But because they do this in light of the civilizing myth, while Kurtz has let that fall away and literally has heads on spikes outside his tent, they reject him as unsound. When Marlowe notices that the heads are facing inward, towards the house, he understands. The truth is both they and Kurtz have produced equal amounts of death and despair, but Kurtz has produced more ivory by refusing to believe the lie everyone tells themselves. Now, Apocalypse Now is about a slightly different thing with precisely the same themes. It worked because there's a strange correlation between America's adventure in Vietnam and Conrad's Belgian Congo. America's war in Vietnam was not a colonial endeavor per se. Its mission was ideological. America was in Vietnam not to help the Vietnamese. It was there to help America by stopping the spread of communism. But Americans, like the Belgians and the British of the late 19th century, instead told themselves a myth. They had been told and believed that they were there helping the Vietnamese people defend themselves and remain free. Luckily, in a happy coincidence, America's foreign policy seemed to line up perfectly with the noble task of helping the Vietnamese peasant. Unfortunately, these myths have the side effect of preventing a nation-state from doing everything needed to win a war. Carpet bombing the entire nation doesn't jive with freeing people. As the war dragged on, America's war effort got more and more brutal, until eventually the entire central part of the nation was declared a free fire zone. The war to free Vietnam killed as many as 3 million Vietnamese people, nearly 10% of the whole population. Apocalypse Now substitutes America's ideological mission in Vietnam with Europe's civilizing mission in Africa. Kurtz initially believes in the mission, but eventually becomes disillusioned with constraints placed upon him. He ultimately rejects the bullshit veneer of saving the Vietnamese and instead comes to embody the chaos and havoc. Apocalypse Now presents the viewer with scene after scene of total insanity, with people who continue going about their business like everything is normal. They can't or won't allow themselves to see what's actually happening. And the men running the war are so far removed from the reality of the situation, they can no longer even recognize Kurtz. Eventually, when we find him, he isn't really insane at all. He's just stopped pretending. He sees what is and has become the embodiment of it. Back to the game. Spec Ops just isn't really about any of the things that these works are about. First off, the setting, while beautiful, is all wrong. In fact, it would be hard to choose a less appropriate Middle Eastern setting for the work. The game was created at a time when America was fighting in Afghanistan, which actually might have worked as a setting for the game, but either because they didn't have the guts to put it in an appropriate setting, or because they wanted freedom to make more beautiful levels, Jaeger Games places our story in a quasi-fictionalized setting in a wealthy nation that America is nominally allied with. Though the American fight in Afghanistan was nowhere near as horrendous as our fight in Vietnam, it at least has the benefit of being a place that can help a Western, and especially an American, audience examine itself. Dubai means nothing to the American audience. Actually, all it can do is confuse them, and the entire premise is strangely flawed. The American soldiers in the game aren't there on a self-interested ideological mission, or a brutal colonial mission. They're there on a humanitarian mission to evacuate Dubai. There can't be a story about American colonialism or any kind of civilizing mission because the United Arab Emirates is one of the world's wealthiest nations with a per capita income of over $70,000. Again, here, Afghanistan could have captured the meanings of the work. Afghanistan is a brutally poor, totally undeveloped country that has suffered incredible death and destruction by being a pinball between two great powers who were looking out for their own interests while pretending to help. First, the Soviet Union devastated the land, supposedly to free it from Western imperialism and usher them into their communist utopia. Then, the United States turned the place into a decades-long war zone, solely to frustrate the Soviet Union. That literally was the only reason. Finally, in punishment for having terrorists who lived there, the US invaded and the nation remains a war-torn disaster 20 years later. Just the American invasion of Afghanistan has led to hundreds of thousands of deaths. Afghanistan has suffered 40 years of war and destruction because two great powers decided to do civilizing missions there. It's not necessarily the strongest setting for an adaptation of Apocalypse Now or Heart of Darkness, but it's at least closer to the mark than Dubai. If Jaeger had made their game in Afghanistan, or even a fictional nation like Afghanistan, it could have worked. Instead, it's telling a story about one of the wealthiest countries on Earth devastated by a natural disaster. And the lesson is, what? That America trying to help people there evacuate is bad? Is the game saying the proper response would have been to abandon the city? The novel and film work because there's no getting around the fact that the Vietnam War and African colonialism never had any motive beyond gross self-interest, ever. In both scenarios, people had only told themselves there was a righteous calling, but looking at the actual situations from up close made that a mockery. It made any moralizing a morbid farce. Heart of Darkness looks at a civilizing mission and sees brutality and the death of civilization. Apocalypse Now looks at a fight for freedom and sees 2 million burned corpses. But the mission in Spec Ops isn't exploitative, or colonial, or even self-interested. It is unambiguously good. So there is zero effective political or philosophical narrative in Spec Ops, where the source materials both have powerful, political, philosophical, painful, and deeply disturbing narratives. The best Spec Ops can muster is, America has been bad somewhere in the Middle East, I think. That's not particularly enlightening. You can say I'm overanalyzing the game here, that I'm thinking too deeply about it, but you'd be wrong. Great works of art get better the more you analyze. You can't fucking overanalyze Apocalypse Now, dude. You can't overanalyze Heart of Darkness. College classes are analyzing it line by line at this very moment all over the world 120 years after its publication. Spec Ops falls apart with even a cursory glance, precisely because the more you look, the less it illuminates. That's bad art. Period. Now, let's briefly look at the other side of the works, because the source material is about those broad cultural issues, but they're also personal stories about what those broad things do to the individuals they touch. In the source material, the story is told through the point of view of the narrator. In the book, this is Charles Marlowe, as a stand-in for Conrad himself, who took a similar boat ride down the Congo on colonial business and was disturbed by what he saw. In the film, we follow Benjamin Willard, who has been sent by the generals running the war to kill Kurtz because his methods are embarrassing and make a mockery of the myth that America is there to free the Vietnamese people. In both works, the Kurtz character needs to be removed because his behavior is messing with the myth. Kurtz in the Congo is no longer pretending he's a civilizing force. In the film, he's no longer pretending he's there to free the Vietnamese. In the film, Kurtz is actually leading a successful guerrilla war against both factions, but he needs to be removed because he's doing it without taking orders. If you kill for the generals, you are a hero and a freedom fighter. If you do the exact same mission of your own volition, you are a madman who needs to be stopped. The game gets the basics of the plot generally correct, but struggles with its choice of setting, and because it changes things that end up hurting the overall meaning of these works. Again, classic works. In the game, Conrad was there to help people. He was there to help people evacuate a natural disaster. His going off the deep end isn't a grand statement about the hypocrisy of America, because there's nothing sinister in America's mission there in the first place. This change of mission basically sucks out all of the interesting complexity of the source material and makes it a confusing mishmash of ideas, none of which are actually very compelling. And I'll point out, the game has a twist that literally renders the Conrad character totally irrelevant for some strange reason, while failing to replace the core of the works with anything. And what's worse, the game diverges significantly in the story it tells about the Marlowe and Willard character. In the book and the movie, the narrator is explicitly there to get Kurtz, and one of the most important traits of the character is the narrator begins the story already deeply cynical and disillusioned. In effect, the narrator begins the story probably very much like Kurtz began his story. In Heart of Darkness, Marlowe is sent to bring Kurtz back in from the bush. In the film, Willard's sent out to straight up kill Kurtz. In both of these works, the narrator does not know Kurtz, has never met him, has only heard of him, and he hears different things from different people. Wildly different things. Impossibly different things. Some people tell the narrator that Kurtz is almost a saint. Others that he's a demon, but in Spec Ops, we start the game with Walker saying that Kurtz is an honorable man, one of the best he's ever known. Right off the bat, the mystery, one of the most important aspects of the Kurtz character, is gone. As the game moves on, we see a lot of war is bad, brutality type stuff, but even there it doesn't work as war commentary because, and this matters, Walker isn't in a war zone. This isn't a war story, it's The Walking Dead. Walker is caught in a post-apocalyptic disaster area. He's walking through an area that was destroyed by a force of nature. There's no commentary on war here. There's no commentary on America, or the West, or the ongoing conflicts in the Middle East. The game instead uses this setup to start, eventually, to make a somewhat ham-fisted commentary on player agency, but it simply doesn't work. There's one part of this game that is famous, and was somewhat controversial at the time, the white phosphorus scene. I'll make a small detour to say that this scene does not work for me because I don't give a crap about anything that was happening. The game uses civilians as props to be burned to make you sad, but it just doesn't work. None of the melodrama, and that's what it is, melodrama, that was meant to pull your heartstrings works because nothing feels even remotely real or authentic. The horror works in the books and the film because it not only felt real because of the towering quality of the artists, but also because in many ways it was real, like it was a real situation. It's very hard to ground me in a narrative that's supposed to feel legitimate and real when my character survives helicopter crashes and falls from skyscrapers before grabbing telephone poles to save himself. You can't combine Die Hard and Apocalypse Now and get anything other than a tonal mess. Either way, this controversial scene is almost comically trite in my opinion. Even if the game had tried harder to make its world convincing, it still doesn't have any power because it's not sure what it's trying to say. If there's one way this section of the game has been interpreted, it's that the game is trying to make a statement about how the player interacts with the game. It is, supposedly, a statement on players choosing to play at violence. That might indeed be an interesting and powerful thing to examine, but unfortunately, as the game is designed, the player hasn't chosen violence. You have no choice in the white phosphorus sequence, just like you've had no choice in the rest of the game. Not to mention, the entire sequence is an absurd plot device that comes literally out of nowhere for these characters. You spent the last 3 hours killing hundreds of dudes, and suddenly Walker decides he needs to firebomb the next section. If this game had given the player an actual choice here, it might have effectively made some statement about player choice and violence, but it doesn't give you that choice. Notably so, because if you had chosen no, they wouldn't have their supposedly powerful statement about player choice. Do you see the issue here? In order to make a statement about what the player chooses to do, they have to take choice away from you, because if you made the wrong choice, it would ruin their narrative about player choice. In the book and the film, both Kurtz and the narrator do have a choice. The narrator could turn around at any moment, and Kurtz could have just kept doing things like everyone else had been doing them. So the effort to tell a story that focused on this made sense. Unfortunately, they just failed to pull it off in an interesting way that leaves the player with things to think about, or at least any player who'd actually read Heart of Darkness. If you want to have a narrative that is a compelling examination of violence and the player, you should really make an effort to craft gameplay that works with, players having a choice. Spec Ops gives you no agency in any part of its game aside from a few tiny and ultimately meaningless choices at the beginning and at the very end of the game. Spec Ops fails at being a statement about player choice because you can't do anything else. There are several places where you can choose whether or not to shoot first. I discovered this by testing the game on multiple playthroughs and instantly thought, oh, well that's interesting. Except it's not. Nothing changes aside from 2 lines of dialogue. No matter what you do at any moment along the way, the enemies will all shoot at you instantly. The game does a nice job of very occasionally humanizing your lifeless digital targets by having them talk before they alert to you, but there's still no actual statement on your violence, because every single enemy in the game immediately starts trying to kill you the moment you appear. Every single killing in this game is an act of self-defense, as the work of you, a professional soldier sent as part of your job. You have been sent there with guns to see what happened to the other people with guns. Now, if the game had wanted to talk about the difference between acceptable and unacceptable violence, I might be more interested. But simply holding up violence and saying, look, violence, yeah, that's not all that interesting. Here's my primary thought when anyone wrings their hands about what violence in games says about us. It says nothing. Nearly every mammal on Earth plays at combat. It's basically the default form of play for most animals. From kittens, to your dog, to chimps, to these guys. Animals make play out of violence. The only thing this says is that animals play at violence because violence is an important part of being an animal, as evidenced by the world we live in, which is awash in violence from amoeba to killer whales. Furthermore, it's not even particularly careful about choosing scenarios to examine violence with. Instead, it's clearly more interested in being shocking and not about actually asking hard questions. Even the supposedly powerful death of the civilians by white phosphorus is unambiguously an accident. It's quite easy to think of a way to funnel the player into a situation where they would knowingly choose to risk the lives of the civilians in order to progress, and that would have effectively worked with the themes they were reaching for, but it's just designed badly for the narrative goals of the game. There's no choice, and the terrible thing the game forces you to do isn't even presented well. It's actually a total accident. If the game was wanting to deal with violence in games, they needed to craft a game that gave the player a choice to commit less violence. But that would have required making something other than a bargain basement, bog standard, mid-2010s cover shooter, and they didn't want to have to do that, so a story about choice that doesn't have choice. It's absurd and nonsensical with even a moment's thought. I got increasingly angry as I played this game because I felt conned and manipulated. I was immensely disappointed by this game that I had heard was a masterpiece of the medium. Several times I seriously considered stopping, and the first time I played I did stop. By the end I had to will myself to continue, which brings me to something else I saw while researching this essay. It's clear to me that the developers of this game think they made something much more effective than they really did. There are quotes from these developers saying they wanted to make players angry at the devs for forcing them to kill civilians, but that's not what I felt. I didn't feel bad at all for killing civilians. I felt annoyed at my time being wasted. There are tons of little things that seem like they were poorly realized morally, as well as mechanically, that the developers pat themselves on the back for. The game has grotesque execution animations that you can do when enemies are wounded on the ground. This was apparently implemented to showcase, and I quote, the horror of war. Except it doesn't work. My 10-year-old son, who watched me play, asked, "Is it supposed to be better to let these guys slowly bleed to death in pain?" Good question. Too bad the game doesn't ask it. Why don't any of your squad mates tell you to stop if these animations are there to further the narrative? What do you owe people who've been trying to kill you literally for no reason at all? You've done nothing. Instead, enemies are just all trying to kill you from the moment you arrive. As a contrast to these scenes, think about this here. The first Colossus you kill in Shadow of the Colossus is walking away from you and a total non-threat. Then you shoot it and kill it. This tiny, wordless sequence says more about player violence than the entirety of Spec Ops: The Line, and it's more interesting mechanically. Allowing the player as Walker to do these executions doesn't show the horror of war. It shows a gamified cutscene the player can play if they want. It makes me feel nothing, and it's not at all innovative or new. Games have been doing these animations for ages. Gears did it from the start. Finally, there is a quote from one of the developers that I find insulting. I can't find it now for some reason, probably because I read like 30 interviews while I thought and then wrote this piece, but it can be paraphrased like this. Quote, "We wanted putting down the controller and stopping playing to be a valid choice." That is an utterly absurd statement. How is refusing to consume your work of art a validation of the quality of your work of art? How is putting the controller down on your $60 consumer product and not consuming it a reasonable response from your audience? Is Spec Ops meant to be performance art? That sounds like arrogant people justifying the failure of their work to me. Just because something tries to be art doesn't mean it's any good at it. And this is where we can come back to that defense of the game I referenced early on. Many people defend the mediocre to bad gameplay in Spec Ops by saying the mechanics hold up the narrative and vice versa. They argue that killing things in the game isn't supposed to feel good, that the entire point is making the player troubled about the very idea of having fun killing players. But then this narrative doesn't work. If the idea was to make the player question themselves for having fun shooting enemies, they needed to make shooting enemies fun, and they didn't. The game puts up a bunch of loading screens that break the fourth wall and that it seems to think are quite clever. It's constantly questioning the player in regards to whether they feel heroic. It makes a very blunt statement about violence and war as entertainment. That might have been very effective if they had bothered cleverly giving the player freedom to choose while still pushing them to do increasingly questionable acts. Instead, they don't, and just either force you to, or even worse, do it in cutscenes. This entire line of the narrative breaks under the poor design of their gameplay loop. Simply telling the player, "Hey, you're not a hero," is so utterly lacking in subtlety that it fails to have any power to make the player question themselves. Why would I question my actions when I have no other option than the actions the developers have literally forced me to take through their game design? Wrapping this part up, there's one other thing that Spec Ops could be said to be about, and that is madness and the effect of violence on the individual. Now, the narrative thrust about madness has parts that work. The only effective narrative tool this game uses is the way the appearance of the squad and their in-game banter changes over time. At the start of the game, the squad talks in combat like any other shooter. Reloading, cover me, enemy neutralize. By the end, Walker is shouting, "He's dead," and "Killed him." This is actually some clever game design and writing, and I appreciated the use of the gameplay to demonstrate the changes in the character as a person. Even if Walker is barely a human character to begin with, he's caught between being generic soldier dude number 4 and a bland, lifeless, characterless avatar for the player. No different from any of your characters in any of the recent COD games. By the end of the game, we're supposed to realize that Walker has become as brutal as Kurtz, and in many ways that is absolutely true to the source material, at least in regards to Apocalypse Now. The film works best because our view of Kurtz is looked at through the lens of Willard. He judges Kurtz's behavior, and yet, the deeper into the bush he gets, the more he recognizes that same brutality all around and even within himself. The film tells Kurtz's story before you even meet the character by telling you Willard's story. They're on the same path, and they've both arrived at an almost prehistoric state by doing what was needed to complete what they perceived as their mission. And of course, Willard is there to kill Kurtz for killing in an unsanctioned manner. They easily could have redeemed Spec Ops by being far more careful around this narrative thread. If they had just focused down on that one thing, they had everything they needed to pull it off. Kurtz is terrifying, not because he's gone mad. The truly frightening thing about Kurtz is that he's not mad. He is not crazy. If anything, he's too sane and understandable. In the novel, Marlowe explicitly says that Kurtz isn't mad, but rather only interested in himself and his grand plans. He went in with all the correct motivations, and by doing what he thought was right everywhere along the line, he ended up as a man doing things that look insane from our spot nice and comfy here in civilization. But where he is, where Willard and Marlowe end up after finding him, he looks pretty sane there. When the world around you goes crazy and you flow along with it, what are you? If you fit where you are perfectly, are you really crazy, or are you just a person in your place? The statement about madness in both the film and the book isn't that violence and guilt and terror drives you crazy. It's that insanity is just a perspective and can only be seen from the outside. That is a powerful narrative that would have worked in Spec Ops. Unfortunately, at the end of the game, the player is shown that, no, Walker's just crazy, and actually, Kurtz was dead the whole time. He simultaneously doesn't go mad, and is totally irrelevant to the narrative. Walker has been hallucinating and talking to corpses and imagining things. He has completely lost control of his mind. You could argue that the game cleverly switches the script, with you finding out by the end that you're filling the role of the Kurtz character, except again, then it fails as an adaptation. Kurtz in the source material isn't in a hallucination. He is fully sane. He is fully in control. Kurtz isn't crazy. The world is crazy, and Kurtz is just playing along with the rules. So even if you think this is a clever change in the adaptation, it is a failure narratively. And what's worse, why would you make this change? You are pretty arrogant when you think you're talented enough to fuck with two of the greatest works of art of the last 300 years. When you make this subtle change, you completely break the source material and totally rob it of its power and its ability to illuminate our reality. It's no longer a story about ordinary people adjusting to extraordinary circumstances. It's a story about people going crazy because bad things happened. It's not even an effective look at PTSD, because it doesn't actually examine what that really looks like. Real-time hallucinations aren't a symptom of PTSD, and PTSD doesn't manifest over the course of an afternoon. So in sum, you end up with a totally confusing ending that one developer says he interpreted to mean Walker was dead all along, and the others thought meant that Walker went crazy because of guilt. Which means you're left with, war and violence are bad and make people go crazy. Really? That's a compelling work of art? To me, that's a cliche. One that's been done to death. The Witcher 3 does a better job with that message in just its open world map design. Hell, the first Call of Duty does a better job with that because it's more coherently plotted. In fact, hilariously, it ends up being the ultimate cliche. The one that's so silly it's a soap opera convention. It was all in his head. If the more convincing interpretation of your game is, it was all in his head, you have made a mediocre work of art. What's worse, when you resort to M. Night-style twists, you inevitably leave all sorts of embarrassing plot holes. What seems like powerful and difficult situations while you played are actually just figments of Walker's imagination, which leaves one with the question, why didn't his squad mates ever directly challenge these insane hallucinations? If Walker is so crazy, he's imagining entire combat sequences, why are these guys still taking his orders? Nobody ever so much as implies that you're hallucinating. The most you get are a couple of vague statements now and then that only make sense in hindsight, once its after-school special ending is revealed. When your narrative, by necessity, relies on withholding crucial information from the player, you're already probably making a bad story unless your game is actually a mystery story. If the game wanted to do this particular story, they chose the wrong genre. A first-person shooter would have been a far more coherent way to tell this tale. In Spec Ops, the player is pulled back into the third person, which by the very nature of its focus separates the character from the player. You're watching things happen to Walker, not having things happen to you. You're controlling Walker's movements, not inhabiting Walker. A story about madness, complete with hallucinations, would have worked far better in a first-person shooter. But then the game wouldn't have been a bog-standard mid-2010s cover shooter, and they couldn't do that, so... Near the end of the game, there's one sequence that's fairly interesting. As the squad comes to an overpass, Conrad, Kurtz, orders Walker to execute one of two people. Either a man who stole water, or the man who killed the thief's family when he was sent to arrest him. It's not handled particularly deftly, but at the very least it's finally an actual ethical choice in a game supposedly about ethical choices. It's finally a scenario that can only be done in a game, rather than doing what films and novels do, but badly. As soon as I was offered this choice, I did what I bet many players did. First, I tried to shoot them both down, but you can't. Then I tried to just keep walking. Even though I personally thought the soldier is more worthy of death, I decided I wasn't interested in having that power and didn't want to engage with it. Sounds like something this heavy-handed game would allow me to do, right? Sounds like a response a developer would use in an interesting way, right? Wrong. Because you'd ruin their crappy twist if you did that. You must shoot one of them. If you refuse, Conrad yells at you and then kills your squad mates and then you. Even though that's yet another example of this game not being willing to fully embrace its central premise about violence and player choice, I thought I got it. I assumed that the game needed this sequence for its ultimate narrative payoff. But when it's revealed that, dun dun dun, you were crazy all along, you see that this entire scene wasn't real. Walker had imagined Conrad's voice and had been looking at two corpses, one of which he shot. Then who killed me when I tried to walk away? Who shot my squad? If you were ultimately going to reveal that none of that scene actually happened, why on earth wouldn't you let the player simply walk away if they wanted? Is it perhaps because the game's anti-violence message is hollow bullshit, and that in fact the game positively revels in gratuitous violence while tut-tutting you for playing a violent video game? Or maybe it's just because nobody actually realized what a massive narrative-breaking plot hole develops as a result. Probably the first, but it could easily be the second, judging the quality of everything else. Spec Ops: The Line is held up as one of the great examples of writing in games. Yet one of the head writers also wrote this. Makes you wonder. Odds and ends. There are also just a ton of places that the game is not all that careful with its storytelling. At the very start of the game, Lugo talks to some civilians and starts with, "Do you speak Farsi?" Apparently they do, because they then have a conversation. Except, they don't speak Farsi in the UAE. Farsi is the language of Persia. Why wouldn't you check that before you wrote? Why wouldn't Lugo just speak Arabic? Why would you take me out of the game 1 minute in by making me raise my eyebrow and go, "Farsi? What? They don't speak Farsi in the UAE." So the game, right at the start, had me pause and go to Google to see if I'm wrong. I'm not. Less than 5% of the population speaks Farsi. Only the Iranian expatriate community speaks Farsi. Arabic and English are the most spoken languages. This might seem like a nitpick, but it's not, man. It all ties back to being careful in your storytelling. The game takes one of the greatest novels ever written and jumbles its pieces. The Radio Man is a miserable amalgamation of the Russian traitor from the novel, Dennis Hopper's reporter from the film, and strangely Kurtz himself. Walker talks about the Radio Man by saying, "You don't forget a voice like that." This is what the Russian and Dennis Hopper say about Kurtz, who has a voice that mesmerizes because it speaks the truth. Why are they taking pieces of a narrative that is immeasurably better than anything you can ever hope to achieve and mushing it up? The pieces are where they are because it's a masterpiece. By moving things around, you just highlight how childishly bad the adaptation is. Apocalypse Now changes the text, but it does it very, very carefully. the game takes elements and throws them in a hat to be pasted back at random. It's perhaps the worst adaptation of a classic I have ever encountered. And man, I hate to even do this, but amazingly Spec Ops manages to stumble into all of the critiques that have been leveled against Heart of Darkness in academia in the 21st century. Rather than using its setting as a way to examine anything of interest, it merely uses it as an exotic locale, as an other. The game uses Emiratis as puppets to mangle and burn to death for shock value in service of a plot that doesn't earn its horror. It's exploitative and nihilistic and pointless. Heart of Darkness does, in fact, examine the brutality done to Africans mainly through the lens of how it affects the oppressors. But the novella is over 120 years old, and African culture was strange and alien to its author. Spec Ops doesn't have these things to defend it. Instead, it just embodies the worst of Western culture, not because it's overtly racist, but because it is unforgivably self-obsessed. In this world of death and destruction, with the ruins of one of the world's great cities at our feet, the game ends up being about an American soldier being sad and then going crazy. Cool. Fascinating. It's fucking garbage, man. Then there are other issues with the game on a technical level that might not be huge problems until you realize people consider this a masterpiece of the medium. The sound mixing is a nightmare, with dialogue too low to hear, and the grating shouting and combat is excruciatingly loud, so that you need to constantly pause and adjust the volume. And then, why does Walker need to scream, "Reloading!" 13 times a fight? It's awful. My son was watching me play and he started screaming, "Reloading!" and laughing every 30 seconds, so thanks for that, Jaeger. Sound design is a crucially important part of game production. When sounds are mixed badly, it hurts the experience. Something lauded as a masterpiece needs to be at least passable in these important technical areas. The music is terribly done. There are several good licensed 1970s rock tracks, but they're placed poorly and repeated ad nauseum, presumably because they didn't want to spend a bunch of money licensing more than 3 tracks. Songs will literally stop mid-fight and then restart. There will be multiple rooms in a row with the exact same song over and over. While the game is absolutely beautiful, even that beauty works against the themes of the game and grates on the source material. Most of all, I want to say this. Great games can succeed in a variety of ways. There are great games that have amazing stories and bad gameplay. Or amazing gameplay and merely adequate stories. Or great gameplay and absolutely abysmal stories. Then there are great games that have amazing stories with minimal gameplay. Or hell, ones that have barely anything that can be described as gameplay at all. There are rare games that manage to excel with bad stories and bad gameplay because they transport the player someplace they could never go in any other medium. Some great games are more about what they make the player feel, or even serve more as statements about the medium itself. But no game can succeed without excelling at something. Spec Ops has mediocre to bad gameplay, with a mediocre to average story. It doesn't do anything that isn't done far better by another game. Nearly everything in the game is done poorly by modern standards, and it wasn't particularly impressive in its time either. Spec Ops The Line might have had a good story compared to Ghosts, but even in its age, better stories already existed. And now, in a time when games have taken their place amongst all the other mediums as fully fledged art forms, now it's utterly exposed as the equivalent of a mediocre silent film. It might have seemed good at the time, but in the light of artistic progress, it's shown to be little more than an effort at art. A failed effort, largely. Maybe that was good enough when games were struggling to find their way, but when there are examples like this, and this, and this, and this, well, Spec Ops looks pretty damn poor in comparison. Alright, thanks for coming. See you next time. Bye.